welcome to our latest Visual Snow Initiative Roundtable meeting. I'm Sierra, founder of the Visual Snow Initiative, or VSI for short. I'm also an activist and a research collaborator for Visual Snow Syndrome, also known as VSS. And today I'm joined by several members of VSI's global research team, including doctors and scientists from around the world, specializing in fields related to VSS, such as neuroscience, neurology, neuro-ophthalmology, neuro-optometry, technology, and more. Together, we'll be discussing our research on VSS and collaborating across disciplines to maximize global efforts. At VSI, we connect researchers to enhance studies on VSS, foster interdisciplinary collaboration and idea sharing, and drive progress towards safe and effective solutions for VSS with the ultimate goal of finding a cure. When I first experienced the onset of VSS in 2015, I struggled with debilitating symptoms, misdiagnosis, mistreatment, profound medical trauma, and a lack of understanding and resources. I was feeling incredibly defeated. I had just learned I had VSS after finding Peter's research online, and for years, no one believed me, and I was trying to adapt to a life with debilitating symptoms. I had to leave school. I eventually went back, but at that time, I had to give up on everything, and that period was crushing. I had been led to believe I was going blind or dying, and we didn't know if VSS was degenerative at that time since there was so little research, and I didn't know anyone else, literally no one with the condition. And when I finally learned what it was, there were no resources or treatments available to me. I had a lot of people telling me to give up, that my life was over, and that no one would ever care or believe me, particularly because I didn't come from the medical world. But at that time, I had no idea VSI would eventually, come to exist or evolve into what it is today. And I'm just so grateful to everyone who supported us, and they're part of that. I didn't know anyone else with VSS. I wasn't sure if anyone would even show up to the conference. I was terrified to speak publicly about my health as well, because growing up, I was bullied every time I spoke up about my health. And I felt that VSS was such an overlooked issue that once I discovered it was affecting others, and it was affecting them in a similar way that it had me, which was horribly, I felt compelled to speak out. And it meant so much that Peter and Owen, along with the other incredible speakers back then, they participated. They've continued to work alongside me to help those affected by VSS. I'm so thankful, just as I stood before doctors and through advocacy work, eventually in front of medical and scientific officials, to assert VSS is a real condition that deserves recognition and attention, your support of this mission has, it's meant the world to me, especially at a time when I felt completely alone and, just as though no one, not even like a single doctor, cared about me at the beginning of my journey with VSS. I'm deeply grateful for your open minds, your ongoing dedication, and most of all, your commitment. While our field is niche and the work can be challenging, we have made historic strides together. Through VSI, we've secured official ICD recognition from the WHO and achieved advancements in biomarkers, brain network mechanisms, symptomatology, diagnostics, and diverse treatment approaches. Research publications, awareness, and resources have all increased as well. And through VSI, there are studies that are actively exploring its origins, brain mechanisms, and both pharmacological or medication and non-invasive treatments. I truly believe that collective collaboration is essential to advancing our understanding, improving care, and developing safe, targeted solutions for VSS. I'm hopeful that through our combined efforts, the efforts of researchers, patients, medical professionals, and advocates, progress can continue. The way I see it, if we don't try, the outcome's already decided, right? So simply by trying, we do move one step closer and we gain the chance to create new possibilities together. And with that in mind, I'd greatly appreciate if VSI's global research team could please introduce themselves.
My name's Alex. I'm an assistant professor at McGill University up in Canada. My background, so I'm a basic scientist. I'm a neuroscientist with an interest in vision. And then a lot of my previous research has concerned amblyopia, so lazy eye, which is a lot of research on vision has applications in amblyopia, and it's driven a lot of vision research. And in that domain, I've worked on sort of understanding mechanisms and some assessment and treatments using video games and movies. And then I got interested in visual snow syndrome because one of my research themes is noise, sort of noise in the visual system. And I had somebody come to me several years ago now saying, I see that you are interested in noise. I have visual snow syndrome. Have you heard of it? It's like I see noise.
I'm a neurologist. I got interested in visual snow. I was a headache neurologist with people who were pitching up with a non-aura disturbance in vision, and so I got to do some clinical work, did some neuroimaging work, and did some work with Francesca, further work around neuroimaging and phenotyping of visual snow.
Yeah, so I just wanted to chime in. I will never forget meeting Dr. Goadsby after years of struggling to find a doctor who believed my VSS symptoms were real. He told me about a medical summit he attended where his colleagues didn't believe in the condition, saying it wasn't real. But then during the conference, one doctor stood up and said, "This condition is real because I have it, and I didn't even know there was a name for it," referring to visual snow syndrome.
My name is Francesca Puledda. I'm a neurologist originally from Italy. I've actually been in London for some time now. And similarly to Peter, I approached visual snow as a headache specialist. My interest in this condition has been present for quite a few years now. I focused my PhD on learning more about what causes visual snow syndrome, what changes we can find in the brain in this condition. And as Peter said, my research has focused in the past mostly on clinical phenotyping, association with migraine and with aura, and also neuroimaging. So I've investigated visual snow through different MRI modalities mostly. And actually, at the moment, I'm also trying to look for biomarkers and to understand changes in cortical activity in visual snow through neurophysiology. So non-invasive measures like EEG, TMS EEG, visual evoked potentials, of course. I'm quite interested in creating pharmacological models that can also be used in the MRI environment to really focus on which neurotransmitters are altered, visual snow. Also, from a clinical perspective, I'm quite interested in helping patients as much as I can. That's not always something that is easy, but recently, from a pediatric perspective, I am trying to focus and create a sort of multidisciplinary clinic at Great Ormond Street, a very important child's hospital here in London, where we want to set up a visual snow clinic where we are looking to do some clinical work, but also research to look into possible comorbidities in young children and adolescents with visual snow.
I'm Sui Wong. I'm a neurologist. I'm also a neuro-ophthalmologist. So I did my training in neuro-ophthalmology after my neurology training. So I got into visual snow syndrome is because I see that in my day-to-day. Day-to-day before it was reaching the amazing paper that you just spoke about that Christoph and Francesca work subsequently. So I was very much moved by the stories I was hearing, the difficulties people were experiencing. And clearly, as you described, Sierra, with the journey, that's how it came about, where I noticed that there was a very natural overlap, a hypothesis to test, to say I would take mindfulness into the treatment of visual snow syndrome. So thank you for that, which had led to the results. And now I'm doing a randomized control trial. Thank you.
Christoph Schankin. I'm a neurologist in Switzerland, in Bern. I'm a headache specialist, and I started working on visual snow. It was like more than 10 years ago when I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship with Peter Goadsby. So the ultimate goal is to improve, of course, the disorder, but also to understand it better and see how we can help these patients and people with dealing with it. So
Christoph,
I had some technical problems sometimes here. So if you miss me, then
Oh, no, it's quite all right. I apologize if I speak over you. I don't mean to. It's just the technical difficulties. What you have to say is very important. I did want to say to you and Peter, I know you've collaborated since the beginning, and visual snow syndrome was something that was on your radar when it was on no one's radar, to be quite frank. And I know Francesca was involved in that. You're all VSS research pioneers, and we've worked with the Monash team as well, Dr. Owen and Dr. Filling, since the beginning. But thank you for all of your valuable contributions over the years, and I'm looking forward to our continued work.
I'm Owen White. I'm a neurologist and neuro-ophthalmologist, and have been seeing patients complaining of these symptoms for many years. And for some reason, at the beginning of this century, it started to become compelling in terms of the numbers of patients. And then with the wonderful work from Peter and Christoph, etc., the syndrome became codified, and also was clear that it was associated with a lot of other symptoms as well. Given my more basic science interests in vision and oculomotor physiology, it was a wonderful opportunity to look at sensory motor networks in almost which can really not be done in any other way that I'm aware of. And as we're all aware, the brain works on the principle of networks, not nodes. It also allowed me to provide some advice and treatment for patients. And I still think the biggest contribution we've made so far is in the validation of the syndrome for patients. And I think that will continue, and I think that hopefully we'll come up with meaningful treatments in the future. Most of the laboratory work we've done, both in visual oculomotor physiology and the imaging work, has been done in conjunction with Diane Fielding, who cannot be here today, unfortunately. But she has been absolutely both complicit and essential in every bit of work that we've done. Thank you.
Owen and Joe, I would like to thank you. I know Joe isn't here, but please relay this for everything you've done since VSI's inception. You've been with us since the beginning. And even prior to VSI existing, you had an interest at visual snow syndrome similar to Christoph, Peter, and Francesca at a time when it felt like no one cared. And you went that extra mile. And I'll always remember the publication of the psychiatric symptomatology of visual snow syndrome. I'm not sure if you recall, that's one of your earlier publications with us, but it was so important to me. And to everyone watching, I just want to say, as someone with visual snow syndrome who has been marginalized, and people didn't believe that our condition was real, none of our symptoms were valid, Dr. White and Dr. Fielding came in and explained that migraine, depression, psychiatric symptoms that are associated with the condition, they're not the cause. Visual snow syndrome is its own distinct condition with visual and non-visual symptoms. And some of those non-visual symptoms, because of the severity of the condition and the marginalization that we've been through, misdiagnosis, etc., we can consequently develop anxiety, depression, disassociation, derealization, and this can even lead to, suicidal ideation in some cases. So Dr. White and Dr. Fielding were looking out for not just the physiology of the syndrome from the beginning, but also, the mental health aspect as well, which I think is really critical to touch upon.
I am an adjunct professor at the Department of Math and Computer Science at the University of Perugia. And one of my main topics is the virtual and augmented reality. And we tried to develop some application. For instance, I am collaborating with Osvaldo Gervasi in order to develop a mobile app for Android in order to simulate the visual snow effect and allow people to better explain their problem to doctors. This is one of the topics that we are covering right now.
Yes, it's of the utmost importance for patients to be able to convey what it is they're seeing. That was one of the biggest struggles I even went through, especially describing visual stimuli like that. You don't always have the right terms. I never knew the words for it. And you all introduced me to them, so thank you.
I'm a professor in computer science at the University of Perugia. I work tightly with Damiano Perri which is assistant professor at the moment. Our topic is regarding VSS syndrome, is related to the application of visual and augmented reality in order to, from one side, show the type of syndrome. We recently published a paper, it has been out a few days ago, related to an app we made in our research lab, and also a web application that mimic at the moment the exercise was published by VSI.
Congratulations to you and Damiano as well on the publication of your recent article.
I'm Ed Boyden. I'm the Y. Eva Tan Professor of Neurotechnology at MIT. And so I'm actually not working on the science or the clinical side. I'm an inventor and I run an engineering group. And so our group works on technologies for imaging and dynamically controlling brain circuits, both for basic science as well as therapeutic purposes. We have helped develop treatments that are now in human trials for Alzheimer's and blindness and other conditions. And then also we build platform technologies that can be applied to lots of different conditions. So for example, we figured out some number of years ago a way of focusing the effects of electric fields non-invasively deep in the brain. And this has now been shown by multiple groups to work in human volunteers. And so what are these technologies used for? Of course, we collaborate with people, clinical experts, scientific experts like others on this call, to try to figure out how these technologies can be used to help people.
We've discussed hyperactivity in some brain areas and downregulation in others. How does this contribute to the wide range of symptoms that VSS has?
It's a very important point, and it's something that I've discussed with Peter, with Christoph, even with Owen quite a few times. And in fact, you're right. The first papers, also by Liu and Gordon Plant a few years ago, really focused on a hypothesis of hyperexcitability, because in principle, in theory, it does make sense to think that a condition characterized mostly by positive neurological symptoms, because of course we know it's neurological, it's in the brain, might be due to increased activation in some part of the visual field. However, at the same time, I think we're starting to understand that this explanation is actually a little bit partial, or at least incomplete. First of all, I think we know that from a clinical perspective, because if you speak to patients, yes, we have the characterization of the syndrome, and that obviously was very beautifully. But at the same time, I think once you start seeing a few of these patients, I don't know if the others on the call maybe agree with me, I think we do recognize that there are, in a way, different clinical subtypes. So I don't think that all types of visual snow are necessarily the same. And that means that I also think that being a syndrome, in fact, it most likely represents the downstream effect of something going wrong in possibly multiple areas of the visual circuit, and not necessarily, as Owen was saying, only in the visual network, but most likely, and this is something that we've understood from the neuroimaging as well, in areas of, for example, Salius networks, attentional networks. And to really understand that, I think we have to start thinking more about, rather than just simple hyperexcitation, of more about an imbalance between excitation and inhibition, EI imbalance. And actually, that's quite a fancy and very common term now for many neurological diseases. We talk about it with ADHD, autism, even schizophrenia. But it is true that we are starting even to gather some objective data on that. And with our work, hopefully we'll be able to share it soon. And Viviana Santoro is doing quite a lot. She's actually focusing her PhD on this study, which is a TMS-EEG study. She's starting to find changes not only in glutamatergic pathways, but most importantly in GABA pathways. And surprisingly, not necessarily only in cortical areas, but also in subcortical cortical loops. So information that is coming from below the cortex to the central parts of the brain that might be creating this dysfunctional mechanism that then ends with the perception of visual snow and of the different symptoms. And to go back to your very initial question, I am not sure how, if we're in this position yet to really define each symptom, with a specific alteration. But in general, I think it's they all come together as an altered way of filtering out visual information and even non-visual information, as we know from tinnitus. I hope that answers your question, Sierra.
Oh, absolutely, it does. And I don't want to speak for everybody here, but as someone who has the syndrome, sometimes I feel the visual snow syndrome does do an injustice at times. Although visual snow sort of is this distinct characteristic for this condition, right? We have the non-visual symptoms, and I believe, Christoph, I recall one of the papers that he published early on regarding it being a network disorder, meaning it was in multiple areas of the brain rather than just visual cortex visual symptoms. So no, that was beautifully explained, Francesca. We've had past VSI discussions that have noted dietary changes have minimal impact on VSS symptoms beyond avoiding caffeine or alcohol, but given these findings recently with biomarkers, should patients consider adjusting their intake of specific vitamins or supplements? Like, for example, GABA, right? I know it doesn't really pass the blood-brain barrier, right? You could take L-theanine for certain things or whatnot. But do you have any comments on this?
With regards to the neurotransmitters that we're talking about very specifically that are that could be altered, we haven't really quantified this yet. Except for the spectroscopy study that we did a few years back, which showed some changes in glutamate. But there's a lot that can be said about the fact that it wasn't a perfect methodology, and that's why we're trying to do it in a stronger scanner. But so we're hypothesizing that these neurotransmitters are altered, right? But if they are, we're talking of really minimal differences in very specific areas and possibly in different moments. So we're talking minimal imbalances that are not in any way really related to intake of nutraceuticals and changes in diet. Again, this is not something that we have much evidence on. It's possible that aside from the brain changes in neurotransmitters, that there could be dietary changes that influence visual snow. It's not been studied, but in theory, in principle, there isn't really a connection. From a clinical perspective, and actually also through collection of data that we did with Christoph and Peter, we did ask patients about past use, as you know, of medication, any kind of medication that they had taken in the past, and if they thought, not necessarily for visual snow, for anything really, if they could tell us if it had any effect on their symptoms. Majority of things, there's no real effect. Either drugs don't really do anything, or they improve or worsen in different people. But there was one category of, let's say, well, can't call them medications, but nutraceuticals that maybe perhaps caused in a larger percentage of patients some form of improvement. Now, of course, if we don't measure that against a placebo, we don't really have a way of knowing if it's a true effect, but it's worth noting. And in fact, in the majority of my patients, I do recommend vitamins and increase in vitamins, particularly the vitamins that we know that have some effect in migraine as well, because the comorbidity is almost always present, at least in the ones I tend to see. So magnesium, riboflavin, coenzyme Q10. Those are the ones that have been tested in migraine patients and that have, in randomized controlled trials many, many years ago, have had effect. So when they're nutraceuticals that I use sometimes in migraine patients that want to avoid actual pharmacological treatment. And I use them in visual snow because we don't have a pharmacological treatment, if that makes sense.
Regarding your MRI studies and possible biomarkers that have been identified, how are you translating this into targeted treatments, so both pharmacological or for future research? If you're not already doing it, how could it be done, just so people can understand?
A couple of years ago, we published a study using a neuroimaging methodology, a really neat one called REACT, that basically puts together data from functional connectivity that you measure from the actual patients with PET and SPECT maps, so actual quantification of neurotransmitters. And by putting that data together, you can really infer on the changes in connectivity that you found in patients, which we found in patients with visual snow in multiple areas of the brain, some of which I mentioned before, with actual changes in neurotransmitters. Again, it doesn't give us a measure of something going up or down, but it tells us which circuitry is most likely involved. And we found changes mostly pertaining to glutamate and serotonin. And very interestingly is not just any form of serotonin, but specific, we found changes in the pathways related to specific receptor of serotonin, which is 5-HT2A. And that's quite interesting and important, I think, because 5-HT2A is also implicated in the activity of hallucinogenics, so LSD, psilocybin. And as many of us know, there is a condition that in a way mimics visual snow or has very similar symptoms, which is HPPD, hallucinogenic persisting perceptual disorder, that starts after the use of similar compounds. So it is likely that there is, at least in some patients, a mechanism that pertains to this receptor. And in fact, with Christoph, we're trying to see if blocking this receptor could have some functional effects in the brain.
We need to be pretty clear too that we're not talking about a clinical trial. It's what folks in our world would describe as an experimental medicine study. We're testing the mechanism, or it may not work at all. That's the science is about making mistakes.
Extremely interested in finding out how that works, how it changes the symptoms of the patients. And we are also really interested in understanding how it changes the biomarkers. So Francesca mentioned the MRI biomarkers. We have EEG biomarkers with it, and all these things. And that's even if it doesn't change the symptoms, if it changes the biomarker, we know in which direction we have to go. So if indeed blocking it is smart, or maybe not, we don't know that yet. So it's a really important study. We are working with high efforts on this, and I'm really looking forward to tell you that we are one step further with having ethics approval, and then we can get all the patients in that you have already advertised the study to. So we are really overwhelmed by your support and by the support and the interest of the patients. It's fantastic to work with visual snow patients because they are really, really helpful, and and they are grateful, and real pleasure to work with VSI and with the patient.
Given the overlap in symptoms between VSS and HPPD, which is drug-induced, and migraine aura, which Francesca touched upon, for example, would you say that what you're testing currently with the mechanism in the pharmacological realm, or any neuroimaging studies, EEGs, anything, do you think that they'll have widespread applications, like broader applications to these related conditions as well, or just visual snow syndrome?
We once published a paper where we put migraine in the center of several disorders. It's visual snow, it's triple PD, so kind of vertigo problem, tinnitus, and I think when you get some better understanding of visual snow syndrome, you will also much better understand other conditions.
The more we look at it, the more we realize that the brain is working on a principle of, firstly, of sloppy workmanship. Near enough is good enough, and it corrects for errors. And secondly, on the principle of very widespread networks. So going back to what Francesca said, our work, which has been looking at eye movements, and does look at attention and does look at salience and a lot of other things, means that over 50% of all cerebral networks are related to vision and control of eye movements. And vision accounts for 50% or more of all sensory input into the brain. So this is our most important perceptive mechanism. Now, given the way that vision develops from infancy, where the cortex is just suddenly flooded with light with no experience whatsoever, the fact that we can actually make sense of that over time is actually a learning facility. Vision itself is actually a cerebral facility. It is the eye is a receptor and no more. And I think it's reasonable to say that it's not just amazing that people have visual snow. To me, it's more amazing that they don't have visual snow or related visual symptoms. It's extraordinary. You have to develop this system that's like noise cancellation in order to actually have some purity of vision. And in the clinical work has suggested 1 to 2% of the community have clinical visual snow. Between 10 and 15% of the community have symptoms that could be considered to be visual snow syndrome. Okay, so they meet the criteria. They have no complaints, and I think you have to acknowledge that any disorder is a symptomatic disorder in the patient. So if they don't complain, they haven't got it. Okay, but that's it. So it's really, really common. And as I said right at the beginning, it's amazing that people don't have it rather than the fact that we do see it. And I would also make the point that this is almost the only way that we can get insight into how the brain functions.
VSS being sort of a sensory network disorder rather than just like being classified as, I suppose, a visual in the visual snow syndrome realm, like a visual condition, right? Do you feel that, and I actually want to ask this to everybody, do you feel that perhaps a name change of the condition would do it justice with its widespread symptomatology? What do you think? Or is that's not even worth pursuing? It would be a challenge to undo it, but if it would help your efforts as far as like it's not just purely of the visual system, then we would look into it. But I completely see your point. It makes sense as well.
I think that I can again go first. I think that the visual snow syndrome as such, and let's remember, syndrome means a collection of symptoms, is important to differentiate because it is actually the significantly predominant presentation, and it is the best opportunity to try and work out how we can manage this. And I think the work that Francesca, and Christoph, and Peter are doing is absolutely essential. So I think focusing on visual snow syndromes has, for want of a better term, significant medico-political advantages, and it should not be discontinued. I think that PPPD is obviously, to me, the vestibular manifestation of this central processing disorder. But I think that we really need to give prominence to visual snow, A, because of the amount of discomfort and dysfunction it causes in the community, because it means people can focus rather than become diffuse and less effective.
And this relates back to Owen's point about people who have the symptoms but don't really complain, and Francesca's point about different subtypes as well, which is that at least in the pilot studies I've done, there are people who come in with VSS where it's having a significant functional impact on their life, on their ability to do things. There are people who come in where it's distressing them, but maybe it's not having a functional impact on what they can do. And then there are people who come in who it's sort of kind of innocuous, right? They have it and they got a diagnosis because they were interested in it. And so at least in my studies, I'm trying to sort of pass that out and look at that continuum by using sort of standardized measures of vision-related quality of life. But I don't know whether there's, are these different subtypes that should be investigated separately? I mean, does this reflect onto the subtypes that Francesca was talking about? I'd like to get into that a little bit because it affects study design quite a bit.
If I can kind of add on to that, first of all, what Owen was saying, I find myself completely in agreement with that. I think that, yes, even if visual snow syndrome probably is something larger that involves different networks, the visual symptoms are the predominant one. We don't want to dilute the condition by having things that are less easy to classify, let's say. And we did all this effort to have it recognized, and I don't think we're there yet with the entire medical and scientific community. So I would definitely say that for now, it's probably useful to keep it as is. With regards to what Alex was saying, it's a really good point, and I don't have an answer to that. I'm trying to kind of understand it myself, because when we looked at it, when we were trying to find actual endophenotypes, so subtypes of clinical diverse presentations, and we did that in quite a big number of patients. We had over 1,000 patients. Obviously, maybe granularity wasn't great in that study because we weren't seeing them in person. We collected data electronically. But we didn't find, we did latent class analysis. We didn't really find subgroups. We found that it's a continuum, it's a spectrum. So I'm not sure how we should confront that. And I think for now, for the sake, probably when we know more about it, we will be able to distinguish subtypes. But I think also from biomarker point of view. That's my hunch. And it's an open question for me.
So I wanted to ask you about the direction of your VSS research and where you picture heading with this, because I know you are seeking funding as well.
So, I mean, there are two projects really. So the short-term project is the one that should be more achievable, which is just some phenotyping of things that we would usually investigate with visual psychophysics in visual snow. So this is similar to the studies that have been going on in Australia that Owen has done, with Joanne and with Alison McKendrick as well. So far, the results that are coming out are really interesting, but in order to understand vision from a functional perspective, there are a lot of different ways that you can approach it. And so one of the things that I really wanted to get into is just looking at some of the measures, looking at contrast sensitivity functions, which is something which are kind of ubiquitously measured in studies of vision. But we can go with the right equipment, you can do it in ways where you're looking more at chromatic sensitivity, you're looking more at sensitivity to things which are very fast. There's some previous research on that as well, sort of in the literature, but we want to do it in sort of a systematic way, and then relating it to some other visual function measurements as well, related to sort of noise masking. I know there's research that's come out of the Australian team for noise masking, but there are different ways of tackling it. And in my perspective, to build up an understanding requires kind of approaching these things from lots of different angles, because when you're doing psychophysics, you're trying to go from behavior to understanding how the mechanisms work. You're trying to sort of investigate a little bit like, blindfolded, feeling out an elephant. You can get all different parts of it, but you're inferring sort of an overall structure. And so there are some slightly different approaches that we plan to take there, and then relating it as well to impacts on vision-related quality of life, because obviously we would expect that the people who are most severely impacted by their visual snow syndrome are the ones who would show the largest differences. And as well, it's a way of sort of beginning to generate and sort of develop that data on quality of life impact. And my hope is, and this might be something nice that we could do sort of across different teams, is try and decide like what are the questions we want to ask about quality of life impact in whatever study, so that we can be building up like a global sort of set of data that can be shared, and there can be a big analysis done across multiple sites, irrespective of what's actually looked at in an individual study. And then in the longer term, it's interesting, it relates a little bit to the stuff that Francesca brought up. I mean, I have a longer term interest with collaborators in the UK to look at EEG, to look at sort of neuronal dynamics. I have a potential collaborator here who has quite a nice model that we could use to analyze some EEG data. And for that study, the plan would be to look at both visual snow and migraine as well. I didn't realize until trying to find sort of migraine collaborators around here to sort of partner with, really for migraine participants for our control group, how little research is done on migraine. And so visual snow is kind of, in its relation to migraine, it seems like it's an even sort of greater, you have migraine, which I didn't realize, quite how tricky that was. And then you have visual snow, which is sort of that times 10, maybe. And so I do think that there's maybe one route for visual snow research is to sort of partner it with migraine research. And that might be one way to sort of help get funding on board.
Maybe I can add something really brief. When you were talking, Alex, I'm glad you said that about migraine at the end, because I was just going to kind of suggest to always have a migraine control group, because it's such a huge comorbidity that we need to really disentangle when we find some alteration, we need to know if that's caused by the migraine biology or by the visual snow biology, since they're so similar. But I don't know if I agree with it. Did I understand correctly that you said that there's not that much that has been done with migraine? With regards to neurophysiology.
No. What I mean is that compared to the scale of what I thought should be happening in migraine, that there is. The point was, for the scale of the impact that migraine has and how important it is,
Yes.
if you talk to people who have migraines, if you look at the prevalence in the general public of migraine, when I talk to, when I've spoken recently to people who are clinicians who work with migraine, they lament that the amount of research that's done is way smaller than it potentially could.
Preaching to the choir here. Yeah, it's a strangely small field of neurology, which is getting bigger thanks to mostly Peter's work, but yeah, it should be even more. I agree.
Peter Goadsby has heard this quote before. Jim Lance, who did a lot of migraine work in Australia, used to make the comment that there were only two kinds of people in the world: those who had migraine and those who were smart enough to recognize their migraine. I think it is the single most pervasive functional neurological disorder that exists. I think it's commonly associated with visual snow. Alison McKendrick has shown some perceptive abnormalities that are different in migraine and in visual snow. And certainly we have seen some abnormalities in visual ocular motor function that occur in migraine that don't occur in pure visual snow. However, I think that they're two sides of the same beast rather than with a lot of crossover, rather than being completely separate. But I think I would agree that migraine is absolutely essential to the understanding of visual snow in the long run as well. The more work that gets done, the better off we'll be.
I think that because of the comparabilities, it's having migraine control groups is useful. Frankly, from a funding point of view, having migraine control groups is more, I think you'd say it's more or less essential, because funding panels are onto this and they'll find any excuse they can to turn down a grant. And if it's almost, for putting an application together, as simple as, I don't know, sample size calculations. There's a couple of things that reviewers of grants will just get rid of you if you're not covering the bases. And I think migraine's useful in that regard, and because of the comorbidity that Francesca, that everyone's discussed, you've got to be able to subtract it away to understand what's going on in a purist sense about visual stuff. I was just referring to a paper of Alison McKendrick's, I think some sort of visual physiology paper that showed the visual physiology to be different between, it was a palinopsia paper, between people with migraine and the visual snow folks. So I think that's absolutely essential. Where the visual snow is, and everything in the brain is close, because it's in the brain. It's a little bit of we need to actually make sure that what we do, we retain a very sharp eye, as Francesca said, a focus on visual snow, and use migraine as a way of parsing into that, but not get distracted by migraine in the visual snow research.
I, from a personal standpoint, was always curious about the genetic components of visual snow syndrome, if any. When I was learning about conditions where sets of monozygotic twins have conditions, or it's in the paternal line, we've experienced that with visual snow syndrome. We actually have heard from sets of twins. I've quite literally met at the Visual Snow conference, parents and children with VSS. I guess I wanted to ask you all, do you think genetic research for VSS is worth pursuing? And would anyone be open to collaborating?
Yes, genetic research, particularly twin research.
We've
already given it some consideration.
Yeah, we had started actually collect. I think perhaps here we talked to you about this. We were collecting actually DNA saliva samples from patients with visual snow, but that was basically interrupted for a series of reasons that mostly had to do with COVID. We were trying to get it up and running again, but I think it's an important avenue and I would be happy to kind of collaborate in any way.
Yes, I'm happy to support in any way as well.
Yeah, me too, of course.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Schankin.
Yeah, I'm happy to be part of the discussion, especially if it means just adding collecting samples onto studies we were going to do already anyway. In the same way that I was mentioning about sort of sharing sort of data about quality of life impact and symptomology, if there's some sort of protocol, like this is what the data should look like standard, then it makes it quite easy to federate that research.
We're quite happy to be involved. We have limited capacity at the moment to do this, as we all do. But I think it's an important aspect that shouldn't be ignored, and we'd be quite supportive and helpful wherever we could be.
Do you have any thoughts on genetic correlations? Ed, in your work, are you seeing a lot of genes coming up when you're working with these type of neurological conditions?
Well, maybe I'll just speak briefly about it because I probably know the least about this topic of anybody in this call, being more on the inventing side than on the like genetic biology side. But I mean, genes are an important part of the story, but also genes make things, right? They encode things. And so we also need to know what those gene products do and how they interact, right? Our bodies are the combination of our genes and our experiences, right? But yeah, I would defer to other people's judgment on the specific topic of visual snow.
I think the way you broke down genes just now is actually it's very concise and helpful for people. I just wanted to chime in and say that because I took some genetics courses and epigenetics courses just for fun because I'm a nerd. And I wish people had broken it down in such a way that you did.
Very much true. I just want to say I like that description as well. After having children, I very broken down into those two things. So maybe, Edward, maybe I can just kind of very briefly introduce myself. I'm a neurologist and neuroscience researcher at King's. I have been interested in visual snow for quite some time. I actually based my PhD on it. We, in our group, starting with Peter's work now more than 10 years ago, we've been interested for quite some time in really kind of, first of all, characterizing visual snow from a clinical perspective, because 12 years ago, it didn't even have a name. We didn't really know about the clinical characteristics of it. So we began with kind of giving it clinical, phenotypical description. I thought it was really interesting. So you mentioned the optogenetics that you've used for treatment as well. So I wonder, do you think there's an avenue for that for visual snow in any way? Or because if I understand, you've used it for blindness, but is that something that obviously visual snow is kind of like the opposite as a positive phenomenon? So I don't know if you see an avenue where that could be useful in any way. And also you were mentioning the non-invasive neuromodulation. And can I ask you which brain areas you targeted and what kind of effects you were looking for specifically?
To answer your first question, I mean, we built the optogenetic tools and then shared them with thousands and thousands of groups. So I mentioned this one Swiss-French team that did put it into the human eye, but many other people have used it to discover other therapeutic modalities. So, for example, my colleague Li Wei Sai at MIT found using optogenetics that she could drive the brain at 40 hertz, 40 times a second, and that would encourage the brain to increase its lymphatic clearance, so clearing junk out of the brain. And in mice, Alzheimer's models mice, they would get better. And so now we're doing clinical trials with people watching flickering lights and hearing clicking sounds. So, optogenetics requires a gene therapy. You want to help lots of people, then a non-invasive method would be preferable to a gene therapy. And so I think the way that optogenetics is probably going to help the most people, if you just think about the sheer numbers, is by understanding the brain better. And then can you design a pattern of activity that can have that remedial or therapeutic effect, but not require an invasive implant? And that's another reason that the second part of your question about the non-invasive deep brain stimulation is so useful potentially. There are at least a couple studies now have come out from different groups. I'm part of a team that's trying to write a review of all the experiments that have been done to date. But two studies, for example, were using this temporal interference method to activate the human hippocampus, so a deep region, and showed a small but statistically significant improvement in a memory function. Also, another group used this method to drive the striatum, and tried to investigate things like motor plasticity and so forth. And so it's the epicenter of this really is in London. My former postdoc Neil Grossman is a professor at Imperial College, so the center of gravity is in the UK, where a lot of people are adopting this for different purposes.
Mm-hmm. So the difference with the more classic non-invasive neuromodulation methods that we would use, for example, in clinical neurology, or that the psychiatrists use like TMS, the main difference is that it can target subcortical deeper structures. Is that right? Aside from obviously the way in which it functions, I imagine, because you're not
That's the
creating
idea. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. Brain cells react in certain ways. And so if we put high frequencies on the outside, well, the brain will mostly ignore them, not completely. But where the high frequencies collide, brain cells act like old-fashioned AM radios. In the same way that you beam a signal across a city, and then the AM radio extracts the voice, you can apply these high frequencies to the outside of the scalp, and the neurons where they overlap will extract the signal.
Okay, so in a way, it is similar to TMS as well.
Well, it's electrical, not magnetic, but you can. I think somebody actually is working on an interferential version of magnetic stimulation. I don't recall what the status of that project is, but I've heard rumblings that such things are ongoing.
Oh, that's very interesting, because we're currently doing a neurophysiological investigation, not for treatment, more for, again, understanding the biological mechanisms. We're looking into cortical connections, excitability, EI changes in the cortex in patients with visual snow. We're using high density EEG, but mostly TMS EEG, with something that targets deeper structures like the thalamus we're looking into. It might be potentially a therapeutic avenue of interest.
Yeah.
Because you can't really do that with TMS. Yeah.
I actually wanted to build upon what you both said, because you mentioned neuromodulation and TMS. I know, Francesca, that's those are two methods we've spoken about before. I know TMS is being integrated into your research. Dr. Christoph Schankin, he was doing VSS research with Dr. Goadsby or Peter back when felt like no one took an interest, and they really pioneered a lot of the research. And Francesca was a part of that as well. So yeah, but regarding neuromodulation and low-level electrical stimulation, what are your perspectives on its effectiveness? Have you found it to have a positive or a negative impact, if any of you have worked with that?
Particularly TMS, both repetitive, where you give several trains of stimulation, and even just a single pulse, where you do it just once a few times a day. There's evidence for that working in headaches, so it's quite well known in our field, in migraine specifically. With visual snow, we haven't done it directly. We're not testing its clinical effects and efficacy. We are simply looking at it as a tool to understand more about the cortical mechanisms in VSS. It was Dr. Puledda, and I think she was doing an RTMS trial, a repetitive TMS trial, which is a little bit less. You could say it gives more stable effects over time, but it's a bit more complex for the patients, because they have to go there several times over multiple weeks and do several sessions. And if I understand correctly, she hasn't published the results yet, but I don't think she got massive clinical effect, but I don't know anything about the method that she was using specifically. With TMS, it really much depends on what kind of stimulation, and particularly the frequency of the stimulation that you're giving. If you want to activate the brain area that you're focusing, also you can't activate the whole brain, you're focusing on a specific area. So you have to know if that area is more or less active, and you want to kind of counteract the effects with the kind of frequency that you're giving. So if you get that wrong, you might not be getting a clinical effect, but that doesn't mean that TMS doesn't work in any area of the brain and in any modality, if that makes sense. Even in migraine, it took a lot of tries to get protocols that worked for large groups of patients. And even there, it doesn't work for everyone, just in specific situations. So I think it is something worth studying eventually.
Rhiannon, and Osvaldo, is there any of the work that's being discussed today that you think you could build upon, or questions that you had regarding collaboration? I understand that you built upon the imagery that we provided, so dynamic visual stimuli and exercises, and exposing patients to this sort of, we'll say, protocol of series of images that could help them and whatnot. And again, simulating visual snow syndrome on one hand, and then also exposing patients to visual stimuli to alter their symptoms in some way. Francesca, correct me if I'm wrong, but were you also interested in looking at virtual reality or simulations? Because I believe that's what Damiano and Osvaldo are working on. So I was hoping to connect you two.
Thank you so much for sending me, Damiano. Actually, Sierra shared some of your work with me a few weeks back. I am quite interested in looking, well, I think as you've probably heard in your experience as well, a lot of the patients say that looking at a simulation of visual snow, and this is what happened to me when I was doing the MRI experiment where I had an actual simulation inside the scanner. Some patients came out of the scanner and said, everything went well, everything was fine. Actually, I noticed my symptoms a little less while I was looking at the simulation. So you've probably experienced that. So I was quite interested in two parts of that. And one is, of course, measuring if this is actually objectively a thing in a good subgroup of people. And if it could be in a way therapeutic, but also if we could attach it again to specific biomarkers. So I am trying to develop something, and I think it would be great if we kind of build on your work. Perhaps I do have a contact now with a software engineer that works at King's with a group that is very strong in AR and virtual reality here at King's. I mean, in our university. So I'm already in conversations with them. But I think perhaps if you want, you could kind of be a part of this, and you could share your expertise already, because I want to basically attach this to my ongoing neurophysiology experiment. I think it would be quite interesting to see what happens if patients are exposed to the actually augmented rather than virtual reality, and then get neurophysiological measures.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are interested if we may get some feedbacks from the medical point of view regarding, for example, some experiments in order to try to implement some telerehabilitation techniques. As a future work, we can buy because what we did at the moment, it has been to generate the video VSI as in the website. Instead of having videos, we generate them through a virtual reality environment. So we are able at the moment to change in several aspects what the patient sees. So can be very, very helpful if we can establish a link with some of them in order to have some feedbacks, some direction how to improve the number and type of such telerehabilitation exercise. In a future prospect, we can also bind those exercise with the app. So in a sense that we can combine once the user find the type of visual snow he has, we can combine a set of exercise that the neurologist can suggest.
We're in the process of developing a more portable system that actually is utilizing VR goggles. It's a little way away, but we also have some involvement with a company that have an app that was essentially designed for concussion detection, but does detect neurological abnormalities. It's difficult to you can't quantify anything with it. Don't know whether it'll work in VSS because we haven't looked at it. But certainly we're trying to develop a system that will be very readily portable and easy to use.
It would be
a lot of talking about it.
nice.
But if we have to, we'll go with the device development as well.
In principle, yes, but you would have to test that works, and you would have to find the right paradigm specifically for visual snow.
That's evidence that the right pattern of visual and auditory information can very rapidly induce quasi-permanent changes in our nervous system. So I've gotten really intrigued about whether, could you use machine learning and design new kinds of things that one might see or hear in order to achieve a certain kind of, clinical or other goal? What matters is data. I mean, I'm very intrigued by whether it could work. Has anybody tried it? Does anybody know? Having people watch or listen to certain frequencies of things?
Yeah, I know you spoke to Damiano and Osvaldo. They're using basically various types of visual stimuli, and they're building off of something we created called the Visual Imagery Project that was developed several years ago, just basically exposing visual snow syndrome patients to dynamic images like moving static and sort of seeing if it had an effect on their visual snow. Regarding the status of your randomized control trial, is there anything you can share regarding the results thus far, if not completed, how things are going? Any interesting insights you found, and what are patients experiencing?
The trial is going well. We have been delivering the groups. So a brief summary, it's a group learning program of a 8-week mindfulness intervention based on a program called Mindfulness-Based cognitive therapy. So it's really about mindfulness. Just to clarify some confusion, others oftentimes ask me about CBT. It's actually about mindfulness. It's about how we then bring in other skills that come into that. And we modified that to be relevant to visual snow syndrome, because the MBCT program, which is an established program with good quality randomized control trials for a condition called depression. And of course, visual snow syndrome is not the same as depression. So we modified it. We are talking about what factors help us modulate the salience network, which then links with the attentional network. But really, it's about lifestyle interventions that's evidence-based, that will make changes in people's brain health, and we improve the brain resilience. And it is actually part of our program. So I mentioned about some differences that we do in MBCT vision, and we do talk about the lifestyle things that will help improve brain health and resilience. And I really go back to what Peter was just saying earlier. We do a study, or we do a research, a study to answer a question. We need to know the answer to the question to guide us to the next step. So, it's also trying to have this open mind of let's see what happens sort of approach. But of course, we all come into research study with a specific hypothesis. Otherwise, we wouldn't test the hypothesis in the first place. And it's about trying to just say, let's see what happens. I can't answer that question yet about the outcome. I hope to answer that by middle of next year with the data analysis and with, I'm sure with us analyzing data and then putting it together. So, it'll be next year. Hopefully towards the end of next year, we'll have more things to report about the primary outcome. But there would be lots of things that would be coming out before then, like this qualitative work that I mentioned. I think that would feed back nicely to what Alex was saying earlier about what are the outcome measures we need. When we talk about outcome measures, I also do a lot of work on patient-reported outcome measures in other aspects of neuro-ophthalmology. And it's about capturing the person's experience. So this will contribute to the development of what we as a community of patients and researchers believe is it's sufficient to be the first round of outcome measures.
Can you shed a little bit more light on, for example, like understanding what the patients go through? Is that sort of what you're referring to as far as patient experience?
I think the clinicians in this meeting will have heard quite a lot about people, well, just like what you shared actually, Sierra, at the beginning, where nobody knows what it is, saying you have an extended migraine, the lack of understanding, but firstly, the lack of awareness of the condition, feeling that they're being dismissed. So all that feeds into potentially my colleague, my psychologist, Janet, she's amazing, Janet Wingrove, and I've been thinking a lot about the mechanism. And I think that is really key. It's not just about the feeling calmer. It goes back to the question of salience.
since you're clearly open-minded and you're about the data and the science, right? I did want to ask you what you thought about mindfulness or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I know there's varying perspectives in the neuroscience world regarding that, where some people are big proponents of it, and there's statistically significant data to back it up in some conditions. And then for others, they prefer to go more the pharmacological route, right? Have you had any experience with mindfulness or MBCT? And if you haven't, regardless, what's your perspective on it? Has it shown any positive or negative effects? What do you think?
So mindfulness, I like to practice it myself. I started practicing it quite a bit in 2020 when with COVID lockdowns and not being in Boston rush hour traffic or traveling, I had a lot of time to use my mind for other things. And I like it. I also like different practices that can touch upon mindfulness in different ways. Like I love internal family systems therapy. I find it to be extremely useful for sometimes surprisingly interesting aspects of the mind. So yeah, I think we should always be guided by the data and by what works. Well, my opinions don't matter. What matters is the data. I think it's just being honest, right? I switched from engineering into neuroscience 27 years ago. Wow. Yeah, I mean, how many things have been cured? As I watch everything happen, right? I don't think anything's really been cured. And then there are treatments, of course, but some of them have been quite interesting, of course. But even the great treatments sometimes have serious side effects, right? So I think we all there's a lot for all of us to learn as we go forward. And so I think the way to do that is to be very upfront about what we know and what we don't know.
I would like to laud what Sui has been doing. One of the things that seems to me we initially lost sight of, and one of the reasons why it became mired in this perception of it being a psychological disorder, implying that psychology as such was not part of the brain, is that what we actually perceive as reality, but our perception, in fact, becomes the reality rather than what is really out there. So everybody has their own personal reality. And Sui is sort of touching on that with mindfulness. And I think that trying to modify that and modulate that is an area for proceeding and an area also that could be validated both by the functional imaging that she's been doing, possibly by the perceptual work that visual scientists can do, and possibly also with our network evaluations. But I think that it's an important area to proceed, and all it really needs is money.
Just to expose people to drugs that can only possibly give them side effects is just very bad practice. So if I was a patient group, I'd want us to stay with our eye on the ball very clearly and make sure that if we're going to recommend things, that we actually think that they might do some use for the condition.
Yeah, so I'd like to highlight, since Sui brought it up, that there was a time when visual snow syndrome itself was considered quite unusual. And to make progress in any field, especially one like this, you have to be open to exploring different approaches while accommodating the diverse preferences, symptoms, and medical histories of those affected. It's important to be innovative, right? When the current solutions just aren't working. We need to investigate anything that could potentially help, as long as it's safe, ethical, and backed by scientific data. And of course, patients, with the help from a qualified medical professional who can help, they should have the final say in what's best for them. And I'm referring to the patients. When I first began with my VSS journey, I was offered a number of pharmacological interventions or medications by ophthalmologists, neurologists, and neuro-ophthalmologists, none of who they'd ever heard of VSS, and they didn't really seem particularly interested in learning more about the condition. And unfortunately, this is a reality that many people with VSS face. Worsening symptoms, new side effects that are scary, uncomfortable, and debilitating, and dangerous. And that's all while you're already dealing with the challenges of VSS and feeling dismissed by doctors. People's experiences can vary greatly depending on their unique symptoms and, the journey that they've been on with their VSS, their medical history. But it's a tough road. However, with the functional MRI component of the study, we now have objective scientific evidence that aligns with the statistically significant results regarding MBCT. And, Dr. Wong, I believe your research is of tremendous value, not just to patients, but also to doctors looking for non-invasive interventions to offer their patients, And this is especially true for those who are severely debilitated by VSS, because as we all continue to work towards targeted treatments, including medication, including pharmacological ones, it's important that we can give people options, that they can try in the meantime, without as much of a worry of side effects or potentially being in a worse condition because you're not using a safe or targeted medication, because that simply is not available yet for VSS. It's being researched, but for those who feel like they're suffering, I don't feel like they should have to suffer in the meantime without accessibility to potential interventions that might be able to help them. The fact that MBCT is now available to anyone, anywhere in the world at no cost through our collaboration with, you, Dr. Wong, and Oxford Mindfulness Foundation it's a new resource that could potentially help people if they're interested. We just want to try to make things available. We provide information, and so that people can they know themselves best, make the decision about what they would like to do for their health. We know that when the brain and the nervous system is under stress, whether emotionally, physically, or from excessive sensory input or an overactive state, I often experience that. it can worsen VSS symptoms, and that's why the brain and nervous system health play a key role in VSS, and approaches like MBCT are another tool in your kit that can help manage that, with literal fMRI showing proof that it is possible, at least from a scientific perspective, to induce changes in the brain in networks involving vision, particularly also, like you said, Dr. Wong, the salience networks. And if there is something that could potentially help improve people's symptoms while we continue our work, right, on a medication, further understanding the condition, and it's safe and it's grounded in science, at VSI, we want to try our best to make sure it's available. Sometimes just having something that helps people feel better in the interim is what they need to maybe help them get through a difficult time and restore their quality of life. And I would want to give people access to that opportunity. I know that everyone here comes from different fields related to VSS, but that's what makes all of your insights so valuable. We bring together different perspectives, and approaches are brought to the table as well. And it gets us thinking outside the box, opens our minds, and reminds us of our shared goal, to study and help this condition. Together we can develop solutions and take into account the diverse experiences of those living with VSS around the world, offering them options that weren't available before, and giving them a chance to improve their quality of life. After all, like, VSS is a multidisciplinary condition, right? We're looking at neuroscience, neurology, neuro-ophthalmology, neurooptometry, and combining those fields is how we'll make the greatest widespread global impact.
It's always struck me that wherever you ask about it, or whoever describes it at any age, so long as they can speak, I'm talking about quite young children, they say the same thing. Say, whatever culture, upbringing, male, female, boy, girl, they say the same thing. It's really quite a homogenous, at its core, a homogenous presentation. It strikes me as giving it a workable target.
You brought up a good point about the very distinct verbiage that I find the VSS patient population uses, whether it's pediatric or adult, regardless. It's sort of the same set of words, or trying to find the right words, right? Because even myself as a patient, I found it difficult to describe initially. But I find your optimism actually very cathartic. But I know that you're rooted. You're also a man who's rooted in logic, so you wouldn't say such things without the grounds to do so. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
I'd hate to think I was involved in an area that was going nowhere. That'd be so I'm biased to think it'd be
likewise
somewhere.
right?
Yeah, I'm sure. And the other thing to say about communication is something that really strikes me and struck me in the first child I saw was the way folks will draw the same thing. be difficult, sometimes difficult to describe, but if they can draw it, then the thing that a 6-year-old will draw is more or less the same as what a 60-year-old will draw. That can't be an accident.
I was going to ask about pediatric cases, visual snow syndrome. Have any of you encountered that? What has been your experience? VSS patients are often overlooked, right? But within that subset, we have the pediatric populations.
Well, you certainly see it in pediatrics, but there's no question about that. And it has the same, I think the fidelity of the description is very much similar to what you see in adults. And very sadly, I've seen a number of cases where the parents they greatly regret when they've worked out that there's something's going on because they've spent a lot of time trying to get the child to ignore it or pretend like it's not there. Or it can be very frustrating. I think it'd be very frustrating for the child.
Yeah, and so building on that, given the impact of VSS on so many children and youth, some who are born with it and others as young as 8 years old, as seen in several clinical cases, the Visual Snow Initiative actually recently launched a new website called VSI4Kids. Essentially, VSI4Kids is an extension of VSI that's designed to make VSS more understandable for children and their families. It offers educational and engaging resources to help children, parents, teachers, and healthcare providers better understand the condition and learn how to support and accommodate children or youth living with VSS.
I just got
It
an
really
email
is.
from you about that. I can add that I've seen, as you know, Sierra, I occasionally do, and actually one of them is coming up in a week. I occasionally do clinics at Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is the largest children's hospital in the UK. And actually, Peter was one of the people who set up a headache clinic for patients some time ago now. And we've started actually seeing some visual snow patients as well, because as we know with headache and visual snow, there's this important comorbidity, obviously very different diseases, but especially us as headache specialists, we tend to see the patients that have some visual snow and perhaps some migraine as well. So we started seeing more and more, and actually recently the managers actually requested to set up a specialized clinic for people with visual snow, for young patients with visual snow, and we're going to do that a couple of times a year. So it's really useful to know that VSI has set up this initiative. And actually, I wanted to ask you specifically, from a clinical perspective, do you suggest that we just link them to the website, or is there actually something that you would want us to do when we're there with the patient? Or is it something that they mostly look at kind of when they're at home and when they need to use the resources? What do you suggest?
Thank you so much for asking. The website isn't by no means a replacement for an actual medical professional's care, of course. I would discern any management to doctors and experts like you, Peter, Ed. I know you're a tech guy as well, but at the same time, you're qualified to do so. But in regards to the resource itself, it's definitely something that I find it could be used for effective physician-patient communication. It could be used by the family, prior to an appointment, just to sort of understand what their child's dealing with, give the condition validity, get resources for the child to be accommodated at school, right? So that educators and the school system, or even peers and classmates, can sort of understand what's going on. In fact, as part of our VSI4Kids initiative that we launched recently, at their school, they have a medical fair, almost like a science fair, where they raise awareness for conditions, and all of the classmates, with the resources we had provided through VSI4Kids, rallied around this young boy who had visual snow syndrome, and they were able to learn with the resources, support their peer, and then on top of that, teachers being like, "Oh, I have this. My daughter has this. My son," And then you start to learn. It sparks the conversation, but it does have tools as well that I think minimize the fear that might be associated with hearing you have a neurological disorder. Especially as a child, and parents might not know. We have a lot of engaging activities on the website, like an alphabet and pictures that sort of create these analogies so they could understand.
We're quite interested in doing some testing in children and adolescents with visual snow, and particularly looking into tests that could combine study of cognitive, the cognitive realm, as well as actually eye movements. So we're looking into things like that have been actually done in migraine as well, like the King-de-Vic test. don't know if you're familiar with it, if it's something that
Yeah.
you think is valuable. So perhaps if we can have a chat at some point, I think it's a
Well,
bit specific thing,
um,
so we can.
Yeah, I'm very happy to.
I mean, this links back to what I mentioned earlier. The only thing that I think might be quite useful would be to try and generate a list of like what are the sort of questions or measures or things that we might try and establish something to standardize across studies that will best facilitate them to be meta-analysis sort of combined together later on, people to do new studies saying, well, I have the data from these 10 different studies that all look to their own different things, but what I'm going to look at is the relationships between these variables, or even just sort of demographics. Even if you were doing a study, you might want to know to what extent is my sample of participants representative of other previous samples that people have collected elsewhere. Do I have an unusual sample that somehow biased my analysis? So that might be an interesting conversation to have. That might mean sort of poring over what people have typically collected and any sort of spots that might be particularly valuable to follow up on. But one question would be, what's the best QR quality of life measure to use? And it's something that I started to look at, and then I understood from looking into it that really where you need to start is with the kind of qualitative research that Sui is doing. And in fact, I mean, I don't know to what extent as well the information you gathered for the application to the World Health Organization. I think a lot of that is the sort of background that you want to be using when you're trying to decide what quantitative measure of quality of life is the best one to use. It's not my area of expertise, but from talking to people who do work on this, my understanding is what you want to ask is initially a lot more questions, sort of, than you're eventually going to want to use, and then you try and narrow down which ones are the really valuable ones to use. But to get from the big set to the small set involves more data, the better.
There is a methodology to develop outcome measures, and there are many, many steps. I think if we are talking about getting to the point of a recognized outcome measure that will be approved by the FDA, for example, if people are talking about doing drug trials to be approved for VSS, it takes about 2 years of work because there are various things that has to be done, from group type thing to data to so there are various stages basically. Just to say there is a specific methodology to it. That my reason for mentioning it is that if we wanted to think of approaching it, it has to be kind of a big stepwise approach, just so that it reaches the stage where it will be approved by the FDA as an outcome measure, or approved when people apply for funding for big NIH grants and such things. I only know all that because I've been creating outcome measures for a different condition, and I realized that my colleagues in, like, for example, certain retinal thing, they would have spent 2 years of their research careers developing something, and it's just to say that that this kind of thing will require specific funding, and it will be back to the same thing, probably having a PhD student, I think, or that sort of a level of dedicated time, or actually bringing in at the very beginning this whole multi-center approach. But it wouldn't be at the multi-center approach yet. It'll be hopefully the things that our knowledge from the people who are seeing people with the condition to the people who are having the condition, and I expect one of the stages would actually be reaching out to the VSS community through VSI to be able to answer some of these questions. That would be a few levels down to clarify that. I don't proclaim to be the expert in outcome measures. I have just been involved with developing them and validating them.
The outcome measures, I might well follow up on with you, because even though it's not an area of specific expertise for me, I do have collaborators here who work on big outcome measures projects, so that there is more than one way of getting there. And then also, Francesca, are you happy that I might also contact you as well, sort of asynchronously? Because I think there might be something we could work on together, at least for that second project that I mentioned.
That sounds great.
Perfect.
Also, Peter and Christoph have shown such a long-standing dedication to this condition, conducting research in clinical settings. They pioneered so many integral studies, and their work has served as the foundation for almost all of the current visual snow syndrome research out there. Their collaboration with Francesca, who is now leading her own multifaceted research, and Owen, whose unwavering passion to uncover the mechanisms behind VSS, from a neurological, also neuro-ophthalmological standpoint, has driven his research, and he also works in technology. They've been crucial to advancing our understanding of the condition. Owen's connection to Sui, actually, who presented her findings at the North American Neuro-Ophthalmological Society meeting, that was especially exciting for us as well. It was beautiful to see another researcher not only take an interest in visual snow syndrome, referring to Sui, but also producing scientific results. And then there's Alex, whose research in VSS is offering new insights and deepening our understanding of, the neurovisual system, alongside Damiano and Osvaldo, whose work has provided patients with tools and resources to better communicate their condition. It's truly incredible to see how all of you have come together across continents through VSI. I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our supporters watching today, and to our researchers for sharing your insights. We truly appreciate your interest in VSI's collective efforts for VSS, your time, collaboration, and invaluable contributions to advancing awareness, education, research, and targeted treatments. It means the world to us. We are committed to supporting this work for as long as resources allow. And to learn more about the projects we discussed today and the ongoing research of VSI's global research team, please feel free to visit our website at www.visualsnowinitiative.org. There you can access our research with VSI page, news and research page, FAQ page, and more to explore various aspects related to VSS. Thank you so much for watching.